Hey there, you're listening to MoobTube. I'm Ralph Pritchard. The MoobTube podcast was on hold over the month of July and June. But we are going to return back cautiously with an episode on Alexander Klug featuring our dear friend George. So I just watched Knight of Cups by Terence Malick, who's quite a revered American director who did Badlands, Days of Heaven, Thin Red Line, most recently, most successfully, The Tree of Life, which won the Palme d'Or, which is, I guess, most characteristic of his recent work. He's also made quite a few films subsequent to that didn't reach as great acclaim. One of those is The Knight of Cups from 2015, which stars Christian Bale as a screenwriter in LA, staggering around, sort of being approached around various business deals, being robbed, meeting with women and seducing them. And I think it had a generally unfavourable reception, like many artworks that kind of lounge around in the space of fame and indulgence. It was seen to be totally unnecessary and pretentious. It has, as the title suggests, a preoccupation with tarot, which is kind of introduced early on and then sort of abandoned as the story develops. But there isn't very much story, as many critics would be quick to point out. But it does have a swirling, wandering movement to it. There's a lot of music. Constantly there's music. The shots are very wide angle, very deep focus. There are often quite a lot of jump cuts where sound comes off of one shot and plays on or plays in. It's just usually sunny or a beautiful sunset. There are lots of huge, big, tall spaces. I guess what I'm here to say is that I thought it was a lot better than a lot of people gave it credit for. I wouldn't really bother recording this if I just thought it was a bunch of pretentious crap, because lots of people have said that, quite fairly articulately probably. But I had time for this. I guess it is doing something in the same way that Tree of Life was doing something. And I didn't love Tree of Life. I thought bits of Tree of Life were like really astonishingly immersive and tender. I think he does have an amazing eye for intimacy. There are a lot of moments where Christian Bale and the women in the film are kind of... I don't think he actually ever films anyone having sex, but there's a lot of like making out and intimacy that gestures towards sex, that is kind of just the way that bodies are angled, the way that legs are touched, the way that people play with each other. A lot of scenes by the beach, kind of chasing the waves. I mean, he loves cliche. Everything he does is just soaked in cliche. Sunsets, the beach, Hollywood. There's even a bit with an Elvis impersonator, and everyone's kind of very obvious and cringe. I mean, I'm just replaying it now. There's a scene where this chap is arguing with his brother's arguing with his dad, and there's just smashing chairs over the glass, and it's just full of cliche, right? But then the thing about cliche, I watched Mirror recently, which is probably my favorite film of all time. It's by Tarkovsky, and it is a total tone poem, I guess. Daniel was on the show to talk about Ham on Rye, a recent indie film, which he said was, unusually deserving of the phrase tone poem in the way that Malick's later work is. And yeah, like Mirror is totally just a dream, like a constant dream sequence kind of moving between different spaces along a kind of poetic logic, which is what Knight of Cups does. You don't really know what order things are happening in. Sometimes there are relationships that you're flipping between his relationships with different women, and maybe you feel that they're not quite in chronology, but then you just don't really know what the chronology is. There isn't really a story. There are characters, and there are relationships evoked through hearing these deep voices, these sort of breathy invocations, none of which I really have much memory of, and oftentimes they are filling in the gap where normally you would have some dialogue that was more contextual, more specific. But what happens here is kind of defies a lot of the rules you would learn about screenwriting in Hollywood. You don't know what a lot of what makes me angry about like film industry culture, I suppose, is this emphasis on dramaturgs and story writing gurus, who none of whom ever turn out to have like written a really successful film, although they've advised on lots of kind of perfectly okay films. But there are none of like the best films of all time were made by people who wrote books about story writing or whatever, storytelling. So it's a bit of a storytelling is a bit of a cult, I think, in Hollywood. And one of the things they tell you in these things, and the same happens in England. I've watched a few Zoom calls I used to go to talks that held by Film London and BFI Network and people, where someone comes on stage and tells you that every character has to have a motivation. And it's not true. And actually, some of the most intensely fascinating films, you don't really know why characters are doing things. I mean, in Knight of Cups, you really don't get much of a window onto the soul of Christian Bale's character. And fair enough, it's not a widely appreciated film. Certainly not on the grounds of story. Most people watch it and say, oh, well, it's cinematographically very stunning and interesting. But I think it did quite badly. I imagine it must have cost quite a lot to make, just because of the amount of talent involved. Natalie Portman, Kate Blanchett, Christian Bale, obviously, Frida Pinto, big stars. And it must have cost loads and probably didn't make very much, because I barely remember it being in cinemas in the UK. I don't know how it was in America. Point being, it is incredibly engaging to watch. I mean, it does feel a lot like an advert in a way, but that in itself is not really a problem. It kind of knows its aesthetic. There's a lot of the voiceover stuff I would say is it's not unnecessary. I think it is needed. But a lot of what is said is quite forgettable in the voiceover. It's just sort of wallpaper texture, and you're just sort of watching. Your eyes are kind of just taking in the landscapes of people walking past in the street, or people walking through these financial buildings, or Christian Bale running, chasing women around a hotel room. And I guess furthermore, one thing that, as a sort of hetero pessimist, as someone who feels that film, shouldn't shy away from its roots as a deeply patriarchally bound medium, it should obviously go beyond that, but it has a unique ability to kind of tell stories from the top, as it were. It's a medium full of domination. And so, what am I talking about here? I'm talking about the male gaze. I'm talking about the fact that, Knight of Cups is like an unequivocally patriarchal film. It shows life from the perspective of a man who is not giving very much away emotionally. A lot of women kind of submit to his power throughout the film. He even has a relationship with a girl in a strip club who works in a strip club. Amazing scene that uses Kindred by Burial, which is a particularly poignant piece of music for me because it came out when I was sort of coming of age, a teenager, kissing girls and going out to parties for the first time. But yes, so the depiction of is, it's quite Drake, it's quite 808s and Heartbreaks, it's quite, abject luxury, misery, and people oftentimes when that sort of stuff comes out. I remember when The Streets, Mike Skinner released Hardest Way to Make an Easy Living, which was his third album, often referred to as the difficult second album, the album that you make once you've been famous, and people are generally quite unsympathetic to any kind of complaint with regards one's success. And there are some bits that are just a bit silly. I mean, there's this bit with Antonio Banderas banging on about, wanting different, like comparing women to different flavors of chocolate or ice cream or something, which is annoying. But then, it's a film about meaningless lives that is kind of constantly searching for meaning, and I think it absorbs that very well. Going back to the point about patriarchy and wanting to fuck women and dominate them, and also having no kind of being a bit emotionally sort of blunted, I do think it captures that pretty well. And I think the way it films intimacy, the way it films him interacting with the women is quite devastating, quite moving. You really feel the texture of the clothes of, there's this very loose knit cardigan that Natalie Portman's wearing when she's found out that she's pregnant, and she doesn't know whether it's with Christian Bale's kid or who she's been having an affair with, or her husband. And you really feel it's that kind. I often remember a lot of intimate moments in my life, kind of. You sometimes remember strange details. When you're in floods of tears, you kind of look down and see that you're wearing like a beige COS jumper or something. I don't know how banal that sounds, but to me it feels quite meaningful. I think details are extraordinarily important for evoking emotion. It is extraordinarily music video like. It's the lighting is just very over the top. Characters appear just sort of for no reason. I mean, I don't know how he approached making this. I mean, it must have just involved. He must have just had like a fucking Argos catalogue of set pieces, basically. Many of them at the beach, many of them in sort of large warehouses or mansions or hotel rooms. And I guess he would have associated them with particular relationships. All you have is like, you almost have just a spider diagram of this man, and then coming off that spider diagram, the important people in this man's life. And then you just try and explore that. And then you just have like drone shots of like the Grand Canyon, or whatever it's called, these kind of Mac desktop lands. I don't know very much about the geography of America, but Yosemite or whatever. Amazing drone shots of the landscape. And you can imagine as an editor of the film, like some of the edits would have been quite intense and precise, and some of them would have been just paste a bit of hiss here, we've got to use the music up, but I don't mean that dismissively, really, because basically it does cast a spell. I remember when I was about 20, I made a film with a friend of mine that was feature length, in fact, and it kind of came from a script that wasn't very good. And so what we sort of did with the script was we started peeling it apart, and we recorded all the sound in post. So a lot of the dialogue, we just ended up, we had a clean WAV of the dialogue, and we had all this Foley that we were kind of, I remember just standing in my bedroom kind of trotting around in a kind of box of leaves to kind of evoke someone walking through a forest. And having all that control over all the elements gave everything this kind of slightly artificial, dreamy feel, a bit like Mirror, which I think Mirror is all completely kind of recorded beforehand. But doing that gave me this, gave me and my co-director this like dream-like world where we'd sort of pulled all the elements apart and created a strange kind of collage element. And it does feel a bit like that with this film. It feels like it feels maybe like a much longer film that didn't really work as a kind of dialogue, story, context piece, and so was just kind of pulled apart. It almost feels like a one-take film, like as a Birdman one-take film that roves around, that's just been sliced up for efficiency and kind of rhythm. It's got an amazing rhythm. It's really, really fucking easy to watch. I was really surprised. I was just expecting it to be really pretentious, aggravating crap, which is what all the reviews said it would be. And that's why I'd avoided it for so long, but it stuck in my head as a film that looked so good in my mind. And I sort of got the feeling it was the sort of film I'd enjoy, and I was right. So trust your gut on things like that. I think the reason I ended up watching it was because YouTube suggested to me a video called "Why Did Terence Malick Films Look Like That?" And usually with sort of clickbaity film studies, things like that, I tend to know the answer, but I just wanted to see some clips from recent Terence Malick films, and I'm glad I did, because wide angles, bright light, kind of biblical wandering atmosphere. Also, some of it's shot on a GoPro, funnily enough, in a way that's like noticeable. I'm sure GoPros now have like sort of log format on them, but at the time the contrast really changes when you switch between the Arri Alexa shots and the GoPro. I'm assuming it's an Arri Alexa. And oh god, and also that there are lots of models in it there's lots of like modeling sequences that are quite inventive. The beginning, I think, is sort of the least engaging in a way. I think it's more multimedia and flashy at the beginning, and then it sort of just settles into this rhythm of following him with these women. There's the woman with the pink hair in the restaurant that he seduces, who's kind of like a bit of a punk, a bit of a Gen Z, a bit of a sort of Tumblr girl, and she's got this fucking scary energy where she's like, kind of like, don't get involved, unless you really want trouble. And there's similar energy like that. I mean, it's very essential heteropessimism, Drake in the club, abjection. It's hard at the top, lonely at the top, lonely getting top, all of that. But quite moving, very beautiful, formally interesting and consistent, aesthetically compelling. But I mean, I have more time for ambitious failures than middle of the road, cautious crowd pleasers. I'm always going to be like more likely to watch this than like Christian Petzold or whatever. So I have a similar feeling about Gaspar Noé, about maybe Leos Carax, certain directors who just go for something quite epic and extreme, and some of it's a bit rubbish, but some of it, when it's good, is like incredibly fun and sexy and epic and spiritual and easy to watch. And that is what I feel generally. It's not that sexy, actually. There are some sexy bits, but it's kind of basically about being kind of not being able to feel, and so without the love, all there is kind of cold lust. That's all from me. 19 minutes. MoobTube's back. We're gonna go for more of an emphasis on making as makers. So we're taking a more, as things unlock and as we start making films more, taking a more active interest in film, which was always kind of the point. But obviously we are scholarly and knowledgeable as well, keeping the balance. But thank you for listening to this appraisal of The Knight of Cups. Hopefully you're listening to it because you've just seen The Knight of Cups and you also felt that it needed a bit of love. Maybe you were wondering whether or not to watch it and I've convinced you. Maybe you just saw it and hated it, and this recording has been very frustrating, listening to someone who's reactions fundamentally contradict yours. Whatever the response, hope you tune in next time, and stay safe.